Simon, some people may not have read your piece in the Times this week, but it was powerful stuff. Just give people a flavour of what happened.
Well, it was a chance encounter a few weeks ago with somebody that I'd never met before, who turned out to be my headmaster's daughter. And, this meeting up with her, she attended my school, which is actually an all-boys school, but we had a smattering of girls there. And so this meeting up with her suddenly brought back to me this kind of awful incident that I had when I was about 12 years old at my school, when I was caned, pretty harshly, and not that there's anything less than harsh when you get caned, but pretty harshly and brutally by a grown man. And, it was horrible. And then when I started to think about that, I thought about several other incidents that happened to me during my school period, my time at school. One where a teacher grabbed me by the back of the head and my hair and smashed my head against a fire extinguisher on the wall. There were other examples of teachers forcing my kids to strip off when their kit wasn't correctly labelled. Strip naked in front of all the other kids, which is incredibly humiliating when you're at any age, but when you're a 12-year-old boy, it's even more so. And, I think that what you were saying in your introduction is a kind of form of post-traumatic stress disorder, because I hadn't really thought about it that much, to be honest with you. I guess I just passed it off as part of growing up at that time. And, and I hadn't really thought about it much. So it did kind of bring it all back to me, yeah.
Do you think there's a lot of people suppressing this kind of thing? Because as we said there, it was only really the turn of the century that this was finally, eventually banned. And whether it was the slipper, the cane, or, something else, people suffered these kind of, well, I was going to say beatings, but it's abuse, suffered this kind of abuse when they were at school all through the 70s, 80s and 90s.
Well, I tend not to look at the comments under my pieces in the newspapers because it's a bit depressing. But the comments under that particular feature were of a different caliber, really. They were mostly men of my generation sharing very, very similar stories. I also published it on another forum, and many of my old school friends and school, contemporaries got in touch to tell me similar stories. I mean, there's one guy with a Polish surname that I was at school with who his name sounded a little bit like the name of a Polish death camp. And when the history teacher was teaching the class about Nazi Germany and this Polish extermination camp, they decided to nickname my friend with the same name as the death camp. And the kids all joined in, and the teacher joined in. They thought it was hilarious. So, I mean, there's the mental and physical abuse that happens, and it was really not a happy time for me at my school because of basically fear. I think when you're that age, you tend to be sort of very authority fearing type of person. But I was terrified, most of the time. So, and I think all my other friends were as well.
Heather, you're nodding along there. I'm imagining what Simon's saying is resonating with you. Is it something you're experiencing with other people, with patients that you may be talking to as well?
Absolutely. It sounds fairly typical, very typical of childhood abuse and PTSD as a result of that. Absolutely.
So given the experiences people had over decades, do you think Simon's tapping into what could be a much wider problem that we're only becoming aware of now?
Very much so, because of course that sort of trauma that happens when a person is a child, it overwhelms our nervous system and leaves us with long-lasting effects. And of course these effects can be delayed. So a person might be having what they feel is a very normal achieving life, but then a random event, such as Simon describes, kicks the whole thing off again. And what can happen is they start re-experiencing elements of what they experienced back then as a child in their body now. And that can feel very, very confusing. And a person can have a hell of a lot of mixed feelings about that and confusion about their identity and who they are and, what's going on in their life.
Look, if people have heard the term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, it may have been amongst veterans who fought in Iraq or Afghanistan. It may be that someone's had a car accident and they experience it afterwards. Is it more prevalent than we think because of experiences like we've heard about?
Very much. So the sort of thing that tends to happen to veterans is what we call a type 1 PTSD, which is a one-off event or a series of one-off events. But what, of course, is far more common is what happens to us as children. Because when we're a child, the nervous system, our biology, our brain is growing and developing at that stage. And so it's far more vulnerable to insults and attacks and threats and the very same things that Simon has really bravely, courageously disclosed so that more people can be aware of it.
I mean, Simon, the words really leapt off the page when I read them because you're right there in that moment when suddenly it hits you like a bus that, wow, this woman I'm talking to was the daughter of my head, and you're back in that room. And it's quite telling that she mentioned that he died and he reached 100. And you, of course, how could you be sympathetic with that, given what he inflicted on you? I want to turn on its head a little bit. Does it show how far we've come in terms of improving the situation in schools, that we're listening to this now thinking, God, that sounds absolutely horrific. How did that ever even happen? Does it show that we've improved a lot in a lot of ways?
Yeah, to a certain extent, yes. I mean, when I relay these stories to people sort of younger than me, I think it's quite important to understand that kind of the culture of that sort of punishment was very prevalent in that time. And that every single comic that we used to get, from the Beano to Whizzer and Chips and all that sort of thing, they had many comic strips where boys were getting caned or whacked or smacked around the head by their teachers. It just seemed like a part of growing up. I think that it's very hard. It's quite extraordinary how much detail I remember from those two, at least those two incidents. And I remember everything about the caning and the pain and the humiliation and the kind of sort of bafflement, really, about why somebody would want to do that voluntarily to a young person. I think that, like I say, the younger generation, they can't believe it, and I think the fact that it went on more. I think I'm safe in saying this, went on more in private schools than it did in comprehensive schools. Really, there must have been some sort of sense of there being a sort of safe place for abuse, that you could get away with it, and that you were almost expected to mete it out to your pupils in some sort of bizarre and macabre way. But we have cyberbullying now. We have all sorts of other abuse that goes on. So there are people around that want to do that sort of stuff, I suppose.
Sure, the challenges for kids now are different. Listen, it does raise another issue. Look, we were just talking about the difference in men's finals and women's finals at Wembley and how the vibe is completely different. I mean, Simon, what you're describing is men doling this out to boys, by and large. Of course, girls got the cane. Of course, there were some women teachers doing that thing as well. But mostly, is this a sign of the toxic masculinity of the time that perhaps we're evolving away from?
Well, yeah, I would hope so. Yes, I mean, there's certainly there seemed to be a lot of toxic masculinity around when I was a child. But it was really coming from the generation before us rather than our generation. I mean, I think that if you were a more educated and more informed person than me, you might be able to look to the Second World War and maybe even the First World War for the reasons why men behaved like that. And perhaps they were still suffering proper the more conventional post-traumatic stress disorder that you mentioned, and there was very much an authoritarian regime around everything that was institutionalized there, including schools and sort of scout organizations and that sort of thing. It was so yeah, I mean, I didn't feel my fellow pupils were toxic, although there was sort of ritual humiliation of other students going on. But
Listen, I'm just going to bring it before we finish. So I'm just going to bring in Heather for one last word on this. As I said at the start, there, what Simon wrote about, what Simon's saying, will resonate with so many people. Heather, just very quickly, if it does, what do people do?
I think go and find a trauma professional. So somebody who is qualified, who is registered, and who has a hell of a lot of experience in dealing with trauma, because you can talk it through and it does make a difference. It
Well,
absolutely will make a difference.